Hey y'all, and welcome back to the pod. As you probably know by now, I keep a spreadsheet of all of the reading that Addie and I do together, partly because of the 1,000 book challenge that we talked about last week, but also just simply for her and for me to know where we've been, where we're going. The data is sometimes really very interesting. The average publication date for us is actually 2002, which felt awfully old. And I had a feeling that older texts like the Ralph Caldicott's and the Kate Greenaways that we've been reading might be highly skewing that. And so I broke the numbers down a little bit more. And this did, in fact, turn out to be the case. Our median year of publication is 2015. The middle 50% is published between 1993 and 2020. So those outliers are really dragging the average down. Looking at that output by decade produced a pretty reasonable curve for what we might expect to see. But one of the things that I was surprised to see was that the 1980s were actually better represented than the 1990s. And again, as with last week, I think the Berenstein Bears have a lot to do with this. It's the last decade of productivity for the Berensteins. But I also wonder a little bit if now in 2026, it's just not a fact that those 1990 codexes are reaching the end of their usable life and are being culled from library shelves. But where this leaves me with is that I would like to read more books from the 90s, because clearly the 90s is the greatest decade, right? And I would like your recommendations. So if you could send them over to me at pod, at toddlingthestacks.com. What are your great 1990s picture books? Let's talk more after the break, folks. Welcome to Toddling the Stacks, a human-produced children's literature podcast for adults. I'm your host, Sean, an award-winning educator with a PhD from Princeton English. In my professional life, I think a lot about the Victorian, the environmental humanities, and the history of the book. But in my personal life, I'm the father of a toddler, and she reads hundreds of books a year. She's taught me that everyone should be reading picture books, and this podcast will show you why. So today we're going to be looking at 1940's The Little Train by Lois Lenski. This is not a library text. This actually comes from our own personal library. I just don't know how it got here. No one will fess up to having bought it. No one can remember when it got here, who it came from, which is strange, I guess, a little bit. I would love to know who gave us this text. And if you're listening, although none of my family listened to this podcast, please let me know, even though you might not appreciate the things I'm about to say about it. So who was Lois Lenski? As I mentioned, this is a text from 1940. So this is an older author who was actually born in the 19th century and is highly prolific deep into the 20th century. Just puts out a ton of work. And a lot of it is very highly celebrated. She wins a Newbery, and she has actually several Newbery honors under her belt as well, and a Children's Book Award winner. Writing across multiple genres. The picture books, The Little Train is part of a whole series of what are called the Mr. Small text. But she also writes what we would consider today to be middle grade literature, as well as what we would probably consider today to be young adult literature. So prolific and celebrated across multiple genres is Lois Lenski. We're going to be dealing at first with several editions of this text before we get more deeply into it. In the show notes, you'll find links to the Internet Archive for the first two of these editions and pictures for the third edition. The first edition is the original edition, 1940, which is a chromolithographic text. Lithography, as we talked about in our Meili episode, a process of writing on stone, or writing rather with stone in this case. Chromolithography is a technology that allows us to print in color using lithography as our printing system. And the 1940 text is actually black and white, yes, but it is also black and white and red all over. It does contain red highlights in some of the images. And that's done in precisely, for all intents and purposes, the same way that like red letter editions of the Bible are done. We just use the same sort of inking mechanisms, and we replace black ink with red ink in different sections so that they appear in red. We have a 2001 Scholastic edition, which is essentially the same as the 1940 edition, except that it's presented in full color. It's no longer a lithographic edition. This is just offset color printing. That gives us more vibrant images, more colors, things like rosy cheeks on people, that sort of thing that would have been possible with chromolithography, but intensely time-consuming, very limited run, and expensive stuff that just wouldn't work for picture books. And then the third edition is the 2002 Random House edition. And Random House owns the copyright for this. The 2001 Scholastic edition is actually presented by special relationship or by special agreement with Random House. 2002's Random House edition, the one that we physically own, is the same edition essentially as the Scholastic edition, except that it's highly abridged. And that's where we're going to get deeply into things, talking about these editions. I don't want to bog us down too much, getting down too deeply into the woods of scholarly discussions here, but I do want to do some basic work with where we are with editions and what thinking is about editions, because it's not something that I think is native to us as readers. We may think deeply about a text translation, although I'm not entirely sure that's true. I've done sections on Kafka's The Trial and Kafka's The Metamorphosis that suggest that it's only people that are deeply invested in a language that start thinking deeply about issues of translation. But in general, notions of edition don't enter into conversations, even at the collegiate level and even at the graduate level. In 1949, a guy named Fredson Bowers writes a text called Bibliography in the University, where he just rails against this notion that we don't think deeply enough about where our literary texts come from and what they are products of and what that production has meant for the text itself in our textual analysis. And he actually goes so far as to say that if graduate students in English departments aren't thinking about this, if they're not thinking about how a text has been produced, its antecedents, what changes have been occasioned along the way, they are actually just too naive to study English at the graduate level. His exact quote is, students feel that modern editions have come down from Mount Sinai. And this is very censorious. It's harsh, right? But I can tell you that what Bowers is saying resonates still today, even at the level of full professors. We don't think deeply enough about this. Whitney Tretchen, in a much more recent work, I think it's 2015, has a wonderful text on print-on-demand editions of Milton's Areopagitica and how these print-on-demand editions, specifically driven by Amazon, are bringing back zombie editions of text that scholarship has pushed to the side, but which print-on-demand processes, which are basically just consuming PDFs off of the floor of the academic ocean and trying to find ways to make money on them, are bringing back these zombie texts that should be dead, and yet now, because of print-on-demand, are becoming revived. This is something that is incredibly important nowadays to think about, especially with data centers and AI and the learning processes that are happening here. A lot of scholarship goes into producing an edition of a text, especially something like Milton. And when we start to pull out these editions that have been uncritical or poorly critical, as is the case in this edition of Areopagitica, there's a real danger in uncritically accepting these editions in the ways that Bowers suggests. And I've actually had experience with this in my own students and their reluctance to buy books for class, which of course I can understand because books are expensive. You use them for a small bit of time, and then you're expected to sell them back for next to nothing. So I get the impulse for PDFs, but they do create problems sometimes. And this is a hyperbolic story, but I'm going to tell it anyway because it's just amazing to me. I actually had a student once who submitted a Canvas response to a text, which was something we did every week. They just, to get the conversation rolling, they submitted their thoughts. I had a student just going on and on and on about these characters, and I didn't understand what they were talking about at all. As far as I knew, these characters didn't exist in the text. This was not a student that seemed inclined to use AI. And so I started doubting myself, wondering if I had somehow missed minor characters that this student was making brilliant insights about. And looking through the text, I'm just not seeing it. What is this guy talking about? What is happening here? And so I asked him to see his edition of the text the next time I saw him in class, and he pulls up this PDF. And the PDF is the exact same title of the text with which we were dealing, and a completely different author and a completely different publication year. And the really, truly sad part about this, the tragic part of that, is that the text that we were dealing with was very, very short. That had been kind of snuck in as a way to give students a break right before they began the reading days. And the text that he had read was well over 400 pages and not the correct text at all. That, of course, is tangential. This is just a case of carelessness in some ways. But there's no reason that same sort of process can't happen with the uncritical way that we deal with editions. We can't just think that there's something called the text that magically appears before us, because that's not true. The author has written something, the printer has printed something, that text has been read, it has been then edited by other editors of other generations, new scholarship has been layered on top of it, changes have been made, decisions have been made about the printing. All of these things matter when it comes to creating the text. And this might seem like something that is very far afield from the world of picture books. So this is something that, of course, makes much more sense if we're dealing with Shakespeare and compositor studies, whether or not this compositor changed a word to make the line fit, thus altering the poetics, that sort of thing. Of course, that makes sense there. But even in this picture book, we're going to see massive changes that have been occasioned upon the text that create an entirely new text. We talked about this a little bit with the editions of the Delaire's Abraham Lincoln that they changed the images on in the 50s to account for new printing processes, and whether or not that created a new text as a result, because the first edition won the Caldecott. The second edition has entirely different images. Is this still then a Caldecott winning text? It's hard to know. The little train that we're dealing with today, let's jump into that completely now. What is this text? This is the story, basically, of Engineer Small, who is a recurring character, Mr. Small, in these books that Lois Lenski puts out. In this book, he's an engineer. In other books, he is a farmer. He is an aviator. He is a guy that owns a car and goes on a drive. It's just a sort of replaceable character that allows us to go on different adventures and to see the ways that things work. In this instance, he is an engineer, and he has a locomotive. That locomotive is scheduled to go into the city with bags of mail and passengers. And we're going to go along on this ride, and that is the entirety of this book. We have 3 editions of it. Across those 3 editions, one thing stays the same. It is the images themselves. There are changes. As I mentioned, the first text is chromolithographic and is black and white and red. The second text, which is the 2001 edition, some 61 years later, is full color offset printing, but the images remain the same. They've just been color added. And the 2002 edition, which is 62 years later, is the same. Those images are precisely the same, but they've just had the offset printing color added to them as well. The text in the 1940 edition is the same as the text in the 2001 edition. And so those are, for all intents and purposes, the same. We can talk about things like issue and state and how individual copies might have things that happened along the way in the process. But the intent of the editors between these 2 texts was that everything would stay the same except for the addition of full color. And we could talk deeply about why they felt the need to add full color and whether or not that creates a new book. But I don't think it's super contentious to say that in a world of color television and of widescreen color film, that it was a good decision to get children to become more involved with this text by adding color. The 2002 Random House edition, though, just elides quite a lot of the text itself. And this is where we start to see real differences and real values emerging from the decision-making process of this edition. 1, anything that was overly technical in the first 2 editions has been completely abridged from these. What does that mean? The 1940s edition has a card catalog entry included with it that says all important details of train operation are described. And this is true. The 1940s edition of this text gets down into the weeds of steam locomotion. It doesn't tell you precisely everything, but in all the important stuff is 100% here. So that a child that is into this mode of asking why about everything will have quite a lot of answers supplied to them here about how steam locomotives work. And it's actually really pretty cool. All of that stuff completely gone in the 2002 edition. Anything that involves other people is completely elided as well. So the job of engineer is somewhat familiar to us, but the other jobs that are required to make this engine go are completely gone. There's no one else involved in this. It seems as though Engineer Small is the only person needed to make this train run. Signaling systems, for instance, the semaphore system that is used to signal the train to stop and to switch tracks and to move ahead with caution, that is completely elided. And the streamline train that the little train meets on its journey and has to move aside for, that is gone too, which is really sad because the streamline train is just a gorgeous piece of work that really captures that sort of emerging 1940s Art Nouveau aesthetic. and that's gone too. What do these changes then mean? If we can conflate the 1940 edition and the 2001 edition, which I think we can, what do these editorial decisions about the 2002 suggest? One, as I've already said, I think that we see that the images are what all these editors believe are the thing that makes this text, not the story itself, not the progression of the train. It's the images that create the picture book in the minds of all of these editors. The combination of the two seems fine for the editors of the 1940s and the 2001 editions. Somehow in 2002, we feel the need to lose quite a lot. So this either to me suggests, one, that the editors thought that the information was too antiquated, which is possible. We don't really deal with locomotion in quite the same way as we did in 1940 today. But I'm not sure that entirely matters. If that were the case, I think we might have just avoided producing a new edition of The Little Train altogether. We don't need this text. There are many other books about trains. So that doesn't necessarily make sense to me. Two, maybe the information is just too technical. And that's a possibility, that we need to dumb this down for kids because it just provides too much information that, for instance, because of the antiquation of the technology, parents may not be able to explain in the way that they once were. This does provide quite a lot of information. It gives a lot of answers to those whys. But of course, if you don't know how these systems work yourself, that could create problems in answering your child. So that's another possibility. And three, I think the aligning of the people themselves, the other jobs themselves, super important here, is that we want to live in a world with a singular hero, with a singular character who goes on a hero's journey. This is the ultimate evolution of the novel infecting us here in picture book land, that we want to just have engineer small and no one else involved. I think that there's something of that in here too. But what is clear to me is that this text is not the text that the author intended. And we could go on a very long discussion about that, whether or not that matters versus the editorial decisions that are being made. But Lois Lenski had a very clear vision for her practice of writing, which was to give dignity to the folks that she was writing about and to provide verisimilitude, to provide absolute accuracy in the information that she was reporting. And I say reporting very intentionally there, that this is almost a documentary process that Lenski is involved with. She wants the world to be shown accurately, because anything else, I think, to her would be a lie. And if you go into her Wikipedia page, you'll see plenty of quotes from her that back this idea up. To use a very modern parlance, that what we're presenting here are mirrors and windows. The windows are opening up for kids that haven't had experience with things like engineers and trains and the various jobs that Mr. Small does. Or we're presenting mirrors for kids whose parents are, for instance, engineers or work in a railroad system or are farmers, et cetera, so that they have representation. That's very important to her. All of that is gone. And I think if I want to be negative, and I very conscientiously choose not to be negative in these reviews, but if I wanted to be negative, I think that I would say that this Random House edition is a slap in the face to Lenski and her mission. It is an insult to the text of The Little Train. And the editorial decisions, I think, were poorly made. I think they were quickly made. And I'm just going to say it, I think they were embarrassingly made. Anecdotally, I can tell you that this is true because I've sat down with Addie to read this text several times, this book. She likes it fine. It's just fine. It gets pulled out every now and then, I think, because for no more reason than that it is a board book and it is not a Sandra Boynton board book. And she just wants something that is slightly different, but is easier. And she'll pull that out and then it'll go away for forever. The other day we sat down and we looked at the Internet Archive edition. Now, you could say that this was because it was on a screen, and I would completely accept that that had something to do with it. She was absolutely enthralled by the Internet Archive edition of this text. She never once blinked an eye when I said the word semaphore. She never stopped at all when I started pointing out things like the sand dome and the smokestack on the train. She wanted to know what these things were. She wanted to know what they were used for. And thankfully, I had looked all of that up beforehand, anticipating her questions. Did you know, for instance, that trains had something called a sand dome on them that just dropped sand onto the track ahead of the wheels to help them get traction in icy conditions? I had no idea about this. I do now, thanks to Lois Lenski's The Little Train, but I don't thanks to the 2002 Random House edition. She was just enthralled by this. And the story is much longer, which you would expect would create problems, especially in a board book presenting picture book, that we would want shortness. But because of all the things that have been elided in the 2002, the 2001 feels much longer and is much longer. And yet it held her attention raptly. And she was pointing things out in the pictures. She was asking questions. She was deeply involved. And it changed my perception of who Lenski was as an author because of this edition. I thought that this was just something that had been pulled out by Random House and reprinted as a copyright thing because it was free and they could make a little bit of money off of it. And I would have never looked at Lenski again had I not stumbled across her name, seen all of the accolades that she had, and thought that maybe I need to give this another look, and happened upon these other editions in the Internet Archive. So 2 things to take away from that. 1, you should read The Little Train with your kid. I think they'll like it. And I think that if you can find these other editions of the Mr. Small series, that they'll like those as well. And if you can't, they're largely available in the Internet Archive if you can find a practice that works for you there and reading with your kid from the Internet Archive. Number 2, I hope, if anything, that this has helped give us some insight into this process of editioning and how even at this very basic level of the picture book, these editions matter greatly. And that maybe going forward, we can be a little bit more critical in our reading practices and our choosing of editions. As we move forward into a deeply digital age, as we move forward into murky copyrights and AI just kind of ignoring intellectual property altogether and being deeply uncritical itself in the way that it presents information and consumes information, we need to ourselves then learn to be highly critical consumers of media. And I pray that we will. If you want to talk more about this, reach out, P-O-D, at toddlingthestacks.com. Also really super excited to hear your 90s picture book ideas. Otherwise, as always, thanks for listening. Stay safe, get your kids to the library, and keep on reading together. Bye, y'all.
This has been Toddling the Stacks. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube or your podcatcher of choice for new episodes every Monday, and follow us on Insta, Blue Sky, and Facebook for the latest updates. If you like what you hear, leave us a review. Keep up with Adeline's reading now, find links to buy your favorites, and more at toddlingthestacks.com. Address questions or concerns to pod, that's P-O-D, at toddlingthestacks.com. Graphics for today's show were created by Emily Tatro. Make a website so people can hire you, Emily. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.